Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for 16 years, and he prided himself on being unshakable, capable of handling any situation with humor and grace. But on a cool September morning in 2024, an 87-year-old grandfather named Robert Chen would share a story so powerful, so unexpected, and so profoundly moving that it would leave the entire studio audience gasping in disbelief. What began as a typical game show episode would transform into a masterclass on forgiveness, redemption, and the extraordinary capacity of the human heart to choose healing over hatred. Before we dive into Robert's remarkable revelation about forgiving the unforgivable, if you're finding value in these authentic stories about the depths of human resilience and the power of forgiveness, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories challenge us to reconsider what we think we know about justice, mercy, and the courage it takes to let go of pain. The Chen family from San Francisco, California arrived at the Family Feud studio with an energy that immediately caught everyone's attention. There were 5 of them: Robert, the patriarch at 87, his daughter Linda, who was 58, his son David, who was 55, and 2 grandchildren, Jennifer, who was 28, and Michael, who was 26. They presented as a close-knit, joyful family, laughing easily with each other and displaying the kind of comfortable affection that comes from genuine connection. Robert moved with the careful deliberation of advanced age, using a carved wooden cane that his grandson had made for him, but his eyes sparkled with life and his smile came readily. He wore a simple navy cardigan over a white shirt, pressed slacks, and well-worn leather shoes. Around his neck hung a small jade pendant on a gold chain, which he touched occasionally as though drawing strength from it. During the family introductions, Steve noticed immediately that Robert commanded quiet respect from his family members. When he spoke, everyone listened. When he smiled, everyone smiled with him. There was something about his presence that suggested depth of character, the kind that only comes from surviving significant hardship. Steve, with his characteristic warmth and curiosity, asked Robert about his life. The elderly man explained that he had been born in China in 1937, had immigrated to the United States in 1962, and had spent 40 years working as a pharmacist in San Francisco's Chinatown. He had been married to his wife, May, for 62 years before she passed away 18 months earlier. His voice grew soft when he mentioned her, and his family members instinctively moved closer to him in a gesture of support. Steve, always good at reading people, sensed there was more to Robert's story than the basic biography suggested. He asked a follow-up question. "Mr. Chen, you have a wonderful family here. I can see how much they love you. What do you think is the secret to raising good kids and having a family like this?" Robert paused, his hand moving to touch the jade pendant at his neck. He looked at his children and grandchildren, then back at Steve. His response was simple but carried weight. "Forgiveness, Mr. Harvey. Everything good in my life came from learning to forgive." The game proceeded with the typical Family Feud energy and competition. The Chen family was playing against the Martinez family from Los Angeles, and both families brought enthusiasm and good humor to each round. Robert participated when it was his turn, moving slowly to the buzzer but displaying surprising quickness with his answers. His family cheered for him enthusiastically, and the audience warmed to this elderly man who was clearly beloved by his descendants. The Chen family pulled ahead steadily, their communication and teamwork evident in every round. When they won the main game and advanced to fast money, Robert insisted on going second, the position that typically carries more pressure because you know exactly how many points you need to win. Michael, Robert's grandson, went first in fast money and scored 139 points, which meant Robert needed 61 points to secure the $20,000 prize. As Robert made his way to the podium, the audience applauded encouragingly. Steve helped him get settled, adjusting the microphone and making sure Robert had a firm grip on the rail. But before Steve could begin the questions, Robert raised his hand in a gesture that clearly meant he needed to say something. Steve, ever attentive to his contestants, immediately stopped and gave Robert his full attention. "Mr. Harvey," Robert said, his accented English clear despite his age, "I need to tell you something before we do this. When you asked me earlier about the secret to our family, I said forgiveness. I need to explain what I mean by that because it's important. It's the reason I'm standing here today." Steve nodded, sensing that something significant was about to be shared. The production team, recognizing the shift in atmosphere, kept cameras rolling. The studio audience grew quiet, leaning forward in their seats. Robert took a breath and began speaking, his voice steady but filled with emotion that decades had not diminished. In 1966, I was a young pharmacist, married to May for 4 years, and we had a 3-year-old daughter, my Linda, who is standing over there. We had a small apartment in Chinatown, and we were happy. We were building our American dream. One evening in August, I was working late at the pharmacy. May had taken Linda to the playground 2 blocks from our apartment. It was something they did every evening when the weather was nice. The studio remained silent as Robert continued. A man came into the playground that evening. He was drunk and angry about something in his own life that had nothing to do with my wife or daughter. He had a knife. He attacked several people before the police arrived. My May, she protected our Linda with her own body. She was stabbed 7 times. The doctors said she should have died that night, but somehow she survived. The audience gasped audibly, and several people put their hands over their mouths in horror. Steve's expression transformed from curiosity to profound concern and compassion. Robert continued, his hand now gripping the jade pendant tightly. May survived, but she would never be the same. The injuries damaged her spine and left her partially paralyzed. She would spend the rest of her life in chronic pain. She needed help with basic tasks. Our daughter Linda, only 3 years old, had witnessed the attack and was traumatized. The man who did this was arrested that night. His name was James Sullivan. He was 32 years old, an alcoholic, unemployed, angry at the world. The atmosphere in the studio had completely shifted. This was no longer a game show, but a sacred space where a profound truth was about to be revealed. Steve stood perfectly still, giving Robert the space to continue at his own pace. Robert's family members were crying quietly, having heard this story before but still moved by their father's retelling of it. James Sullivan was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison, Robert said. I was supposed to feel justice had been served, but I didn't feel justice. I felt only rage. Every day, watching my May struggle with pain, watching my daughter have nightmares, watching our dreams disappear, I felt rage at this man who had destroyed our lives for no reason. The rage was eating me alive, Mr. Harvey. It was destroying me from the inside. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I couldn't be a good husband or father because I was consumed with hatred. Robert paused, and Steve moved closer, placing a supportive hand on the elderly man's shoulder. The entire studio seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Robert looked directly into Steve's eyes as he continued. One day, about a year after the attack, I was at the pharmacy and I couldn't remember how to fill a prescription. My mind had become so clouded with anger that I couldn't function. I realized that James Sullivan had not just hurt my wife that night. He was continuing to hurt my entire family every single day through my inability to let go of what he had done. He was in prison, but I had built a prison in my own mind and I was trapped in it. The audience was transfixed, many people openly weeping as they absorbed Robert's words. He continued, his voice growing stronger. So I made a decision that everyone told me was crazy. I decided to forgive him. Not because he deserved forgiveness. He didn't, not because the crime wasn't serious. It was devastating, but because holding on to the hatred was destroying everything I had left that was good. It was poisoning my marriage, my relationship with my daughter, my health, my peace, everything. I chose to forgive James Sullivan to save myself and my family. Steve Harvey, a man rarely at a loss for words, stood speechless. The audience sat in stunned silence. Robert wasn't finished. But I didn't just decide to forgive in my mind, Mr. Harvey. I took action. I went to the prison. I requested to meet with James Sullivan. It took months for the request to be approved because the prison officials thought I wanted to hurt him. But finally, they arranged a meeting with guards present. The gasps from the audience were audible now, people shocked that Robert had actually sought out the man who had destroyed his family's life. Robert continued, and what he said next would become one of the most powerful moments in television history. When I sat across from James Sullivan in that prison visiting room, I saw something I didn't expect. I saw a broken human being. I saw a man destroyed by his own choices, filled with remorse so deep he could barely look at me. He started crying before I even said anything. He said, "I'm sorry," over and over. He said he wished he had died that night instead of surviving to live with what he had done. Robert's voice cracked with emotion as he recounted what happened next. I looked at this man and I realized something important. Hating him didn't undo what happened. It didn't heal my wife. It didn't erase my daughter's trauma. It only added more suffering to the world. So I told him something that shocked him and shocked me as I said it. I said, "I forgive you. I don't excuse what you did. I will never say it was okay, but I release you from my hatred because carrying it is killing me, and I release myself from the prison of anger." Then I did something even more surprising. I offered to help him. The studio audience erupted in gasps and murmurs of disbelief. Steve's eyes widened and he shook his head in amazement. Robert explained, James Sullivan was an alcoholic. He had never addressed his addiction. I told him that when he was in prison, I would help him get into rehabilitation programs. I would write letters supporting his participation in educational programs. I told him that if he genuinely wanted to change, to become a better person, I would help him do that. Not because he deserved my help, but because I needed to transform my pain into something constructive. Robert paused to wipe his eyes before continuing. Over the next 20 years, while James Sullivan served his sentence, I visited him 4 times a year. I helped him get sober. I helped him complete his GED and then take college courses through the prison education program. I helped him learn to read and write properly. I helped him face what he had done and understand the impact of his actions. And slowly, year by year, something miraculous happened. The man who had been a violent alcoholic became a man committed to redemption. And I, who had been consumed by rage, became a man at peace. The audience was completely silent now, absorbing the magnitude of what Robert was sharing. Steve Harvey had tears streaming down his face, making no attempt to hide his emotion. Robert continued, James Sullivan was released from prison in 1991 after serving 25 years. By then, he was 57 years old. He had no family, no support system, nowhere to go. Do you know what I did, Mr. Harvey? Steve shook his head, unable to speak. Robert said, I helped him find a job. I helped him find an apartment. I invited him to our home for holidays. The man who had nearly killed my wife became, over time, someone we considered family. The audience gasped again, several people crying out in disbelief. This revelation went beyond anything anyone could have anticipated. Steve finally found his voice, hoarse with emotion. Mr. Chen, Robert, I don't even know what to say. How did your wife feel about this? How did your daughter react? Robert smiled through his tears. That's the beautiful part, Mr. Harvey. My May, who suffered more than anyone from what James did, she understood immediately why I needed to forgive. She had been watching the rage destroy me, and she told me she would support whatever I needed to do to find peace. When I first told her I wanted to meet with James, she said, if forgiving him will bring you peace, then forgive him for both of us. Robert's daughter Linda stepped forward from where the family stood, asking if she could speak. Steve immediately invited her to join them. Linda, her face wet with tears, addressed the audience directly. I was 3 years old when it happened, but the trauma shaped my entire childhood. I had nightmares for years. I was afraid of strangers. I struggled with anxiety and fear. When my father told me he was going to visit the man who hurt my mother, I was angry. I didn't understand. But as I grew older and watched my father transform from an angry, bitter man into a peaceful, joyful person, I began to understand. His forgiveness didn't just free James Sullivan, it freed our entire family. She continued, her voice strong despite her emotion. When I was 25 years old, I met James Sullivan for the first time since that terrible night. My father brought him to our home for Thanksgiving dinner. I was terrified. But when I saw him, I didn't see a monster. I saw a man who had spent 25 years paying for his crime and genuinely trying to become better. I saw a man who looked at my mother with such profound remorse and gratitude that it was impossible not to recognize his transformation. And I realized that my father's forgiveness had created something beautiful from something horrible. Robert spoke again, his voice filled with emotion but also with conviction. James Sullivan lived for 22 years after his release. He never drank again. He worked with programs helping people with addiction. He volunteered at homeless shelters. He dedicated the rest of his life to making amends by helping others. He came to our family gatherings. He was present at my grandchildren's births. When my May passed away 18 months ago, James Sullivan was at her funeral, and he cried as hard as anyone because he had learned to genuinely love the woman whose life he had nearly taken. And 3 months ago, when James died of cancer at age 89, I held his hand as he passed, and his last words were, "Thank you for teaching me that people can change, that redemption is possible, that forgiveness is real." The studio was in complete emotional upheaval. People were sobbing openly, including the camera operators, the production staff, and Steve Harvey himself. The Martinez family, their competitors, had joined the Chen family on stage, all of them crying and embracing the Chens. Steve couldn't continue with the game. He stood there, shaking his head in wonder, trying to process what he had just heard. Finally, Steve spoke, his voice breaking repeatedly as he tried to articulate what everyone was feeling. Mr. Chen, Robert, I have been in this business a long time. I have heard a lot of stories. But what you just shared with us is the most powerful testament to the human capacity for forgiveness and redemption that I have ever encountered. You didn't just forgive someone who hurt you. You actively helped him become a better person. You welcomed him into your family. You loved him. That goes beyond forgiveness into something I don't even have words for. Robert nodded, accepting Steve's words. Then he said something that would become the most quoted line from the entire episode. Mr. Harvey, people think forgiveness is about letting someone off the hook, but forgiveness is not about them. It's about you. It's about refusing to let someone else's worst moment define the rest of your life. It's about choosing peace over justice, healing over revenge, love over hate. James Sullivan was punished by the legal system, and he deserved that punishment. But I would have remained imprisoned by my own hatred if I hadn't chosen to forgive. Forgiveness freed me, and it gave him the chance to become someone worth knowing. Steve turned to address the audience and the cameras. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not going to finish this game the regular way. What we have witnessed here today transcends any game show. The Chen family has already won something far more valuable than $20,000. They've won wisdom, peace, and the kind of family bonds that come from choosing love and forgiveness in the face of unimaginable pain. But you know what? We're giving them the $20,000 anyway because this story needs to be shared with the world. The audience erupted in applause that lasted for several minutes. The producers, without hesitation, agreed with Steve's decision to award the prize regardless of whether they completed fast money. But Robert, with characteristic grace, insisted they at least attempt the questions to honor the game. So they proceeded, and Robert answered each question with calm certainty, scoring enough points to win legitimately. His family rushed the stage to embrace him, and what followed was one of the longest standing ovations in Family Feud history. When the episode aired 8 weeks later, the response was immediate and extraordinary. Within 24 hours, the clip of Robert explaining his forgiveness of James Sullivan had been viewed over 50 million times across various social media platforms. News outlets worldwide picked up the story. Theologians, psychologists, criminal justice reformers, and peace activists all weighed in on the profound implications of Robert's choice to forgive and actively help the man who had devastated his family. Restorative justice organizations requested permission to use Robert's story in their educational materials, illustrating the difference between punishment and rehabilitation, between vengeance and healing. Victims' rights groups engaged in thoughtful discussions about the complexity of forgiveness, acknowledging that Robert's choice was extraordinary and personal, but also recognizing the power it had demonstrated. Prison reform advocates pointed to James Sullivan's transformation as evidence that people can change when given support and opportunity, even after committing serious crimes. Religious communities of all traditions embraced Robert's story as a living example of their teachings about forgiveness, mercy, and redemption. Churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples used the footage in services and educational programs. Interfaith organizations highlighted how Robert's actions transcended any single religious tradition, speaking to universal human values about our capacity to choose love over hatred. One prominent religious leader commented that Robert had demonstrated the kind of forgiveness that their scriptures advocated, but that they had rarely seen lived out so completely in real life. Mental health professionals discussed the psychological benefits of forgiveness that Robert had described. Research consistently shows that holding on to anger and resentment has documented negative effects on physical and mental health, including increased stress, higher blood pressure, greater risk of depression, and reduced life satisfaction. Robert's testimony about how rage was destroying him from the inside validated what clinicians see regularly, that unforgiveness often hurts the person holding the grudge more than the person being resented. His decision to forgive as an act of self-preservation and healing resonated with therapeutic approaches that encourage forgiveness not as an obligation, but as a gift people give themselves. Educational institutions began using Robert's story in courses on ethics, conflict resolution, and human psychology. Students analyzed the decision-making process that led Robert to forgive, the courage it took to meet with his wife's attacker, and the sustained commitment required to help James Sullivan rehabilitate. Debate teams used the case to discuss questions about justice, mercy, and whether victims have an obligation to forgive those who harm them. Philosophy classes examined the story through various ethical frameworks, considering whether Robert's actions were supererogatory, going beyond what morality requires, or whether forgiveness and helping offenders rehabilitate should be more normative responses. Steve Harvey devoted an entire episode of his talk show to exploring forgiveness and redemption, with Robert Chen as his featured guest. During that interview, Robert shared additional details that made the story even more powerful. He revealed that in the years after James Sullivan's release, James had worked tirelessly to make amends, not just to the Chen family, but to society. He had volunteered thousands of hours at addiction recovery centers, sharing his story to help others understand the devastating consequences of substance abuse. He had spoken at schools about making better choices. He had written a memoir documenting his journey from violent criminal to redeemed citizen, with all proceeds going to victims' assistance programs. Robert also shared that James had established a fund before his death that would continue supporting addiction treatment programs and victims of violent crime. The fund was substantial, representing James's life savings and the proceeds from his memoir. Robert explained that James had lived extremely modestly after his release, saving almost everything he earned because he wanted to do something meaningful to counterbalance the harm he had caused. The establishment of this fund was James's way of ensuring his redemption would outlive him, that some good would continue to flow from his transformation long after he was gone. During the talk show interview, Steve asked Robert the question many viewers were wondering. Was there ever a moment when you regretted forgiving him, when you questioned your decision? Robert's answer was immediate and certain. Never, not once, because forgiveness gave me back my life. Before I forgave James, I was barely living. I was going through the motions, but inside I was dead. Forgiveness resurrected me. It allowed me to be present for my wife during her pain instead of being consumed by my own rage. It allowed me to be a good father to my daughter. It allowed me to experience joy again. Whatever James got from my forgiveness, I got far more. Robert's granddaughter, Jennifer, who had been born years after the attack but grew up knowing James Sullivan as an honorary grandfather figure, shared her perspective during a follow-up interview. She explained that growing up with the knowledge of what James had done to her grandmother, yet seeing him treated as family, had shaped her understanding of human nature in profound ways. She had learned that people are not defined by their worst actions, that genuine change is possible, that mercy and accountability are not mutually exclusive, and that choosing to love and forgive creates more healing than choosing to hate and punish. Jennifer revealed that she had become a social worker specializing in restorative justice programs, directly inspired by her grandfather's example. She worked with victims and offenders, facilitating dialogue and healing in cases of serious crime. She explained that while not every victim could or should forgive as her grandfather had, and while forgiveness was never an obligation, the restorative justice model offered opportunities for healing that the traditional punitive system often failed to provide. Her grandfather's story had shown her that transformation was possible on both sides, that victims could find peace and offenders could find redemption when given the chance. The broader impact of Robert's story extended into criminal justice reform discussions. Advocates for rehabilitation, focused incarceration, pointed to James Sullivan's transformation as evidence that people can change when prisons provide education, treatment, and support, rather than merely warehousing inmates. They argued that Robert's willingness to help James should challenge society to invest more in programs that facilitate genuine rehabilitation. Critics of mass incarceration use the story to illustrate that punishment alone doesn't create public safety, but helping people change does. Victims' advocates had more complex responses, and Robert acknowledged this complexity in subsequent interviews. He emphasized repeatedly that his choice to forgive was personal and that no victim should ever feel pressured to forgive their offender. He explained that forgiveness is a gift that victims can choose to give, but never an obligation they must fulfill. He stressed that his forgiveness of James didn't minimize the seriousness of the crime or suggest that James shouldn't have been punished. The legal consequences were appropriate and necessary. His forgiveness operated in a different realm, addressing his own healing and eventually offering James a path to redemption after he had served his sentence. Robert also addressed the question of whether his forgiveness was only possible because his wife survived the attack. He acknowledged that if May had died, he honestly didn't know whether he could have forgiven. The fact that she lived, even with lifelong disabilities and pain, made his choice to forgive somewhat easier because he still had her. He recognized that people whose loved ones were murdered faced an even more difficult path to forgiveness, and he refused to judge anyone who couldn't walk that path. His message was not that everyone must forgive, but rather that forgiveness is possible even in terrible circumstances, and that choosing it can bring peace. The jade pendant Robert wore, which he had touched repeatedly throughout his time on Family Feud, had its own significance that he revealed during the talk show interview. The pendant had belonged to his wife, May. She had worn it every day of their marriage until her death, and on her deathbed she had asked Robert to wear it and remember that love is stronger than hate, that mercy is more powerful than vengeance, and that their choice to forgive James Sullivan had been the right one. May had never regretted their decision to forgive, Robert explained. Despite her decades of chronic pain and disability, she had found peace in forgiveness and had even developed genuine affection for James over the years. She had seen his transformation as proof that their suffering had not been meaningless, that some redemption had emerged from tragedy. Universities and research institutions began studying what became known as the Chen model of radical forgiveness, examining the psychological, social, and practical dimensions of Robert's approach. Researchers interviewed the Chen family extensively, analyzed the progression of James Sullivan's rehabilitation, and investigated the outcomes of this extraordinary case of victim-offender reconciliation. Their findings suggested that Robert's active involvement in James's rehabilitation, rather than passive forgiveness from a distance, had been crucial to both men's healing. The ongoing relationship had allowed Robert to witness James's genuine transformation, which reinforced his forgiveness, while James's regular contact with the consequences of his actions through the Chen family prevented him from minimizing what he had done. Mental health professionals noted several key factors that made Robert's forgiveness sustainable over decades. First, James had shown genuine remorse immediately and consistently over the years. He never minimized his crime or made excuses. Second, James took concrete actions to change, getting sober, educating himself, and dedicating his life to helping others. Third, the Chen family's forgiveness was not immediate but evolved over time, giving Robert space to process his rage before extending mercy. Fourth, Robert maintained appropriate boundaries early on, forgiving while still allowing the justice system to hold James accountable. These elements together created a context where forgiveness could flourish rather than being a one-time declaration that felt hollow. 1 year after Robert's appearance on Family Feud, the show did a follow-up segment documenting the impact his story had created. They interviewed dozens of people whose lives had been changed by witnessing Robert's testimony. There was the father whose son had been killed by a drunk driver, who had been consumed by hatred for 15 years until seeing Robert's story inspired him to begin his own journey toward forgiveness. There was the woman serving time for a crime she committed in her 20s, who had given up on herself until Robert's story showed her that redemption was possible. There was the therapist who started incorporating Robert's insights about forgiveness as self-liberation into her practice with trauma survivors. There was the criminal justice reformer who cited Robert's story in testimony before the state legislature, helping to pass legislation expanding rehabilitation programs in prisons. The Chen family had received thousands of letters from people sharing how Robert's story had impacted them. Some were from victims of crimes who felt less alone in their struggle to forgive. Some were from offenders who found hope that they could change and make amends. Some were from people dealing with everyday hurts and betrayals who realized that if Robert could forgive attempted murder, perhaps they could forgive lesser offenses. Some were from people who had been carrying grudges for decades and decided it was finally time to let go. The common thread in all these letters was that Robert's testimony had challenged people's assumptions about what forgiveness means and what human beings are capable of when they choose love over hate. Robert lived for 2 more years after his appearance on Family Feud, passing away peacefully in October 2026 at the age of 89. His obituary, published in major newspapers nationwide, focused not on his career or accomplishments, but on his extraordinary act of forgiveness and the ripple effects it created. His funeral drew hundreds of people, including former prison inmates James Sullivan had helped, addiction counselors who had worked with James, restorative justice advocates who had been inspired by the story, and countless individuals who had never met Robert but whose lives had been changed by his example. At Robert's funeral, his daughter Linda shared a letter her father had written to be read after his death. In it, Robert addressed the question he had been asked most frequently, why he had forgiven the unforgivable. His answer provided a fitting conclusion to his remarkable story. He wrote that he had forgiven because he understood that holding on to hatred would mean that James Sullivan's one terrible action, committed in a moment of drunken rage, would define not just James's entire life, but also Robert's entire life and his family's experience. By forgiving, Robert had refused to give that one terrible moment such power. He had reclaimed his agency, his peace, and his capacity for joy. Robert wrote that forgiveness had taught him the most important lesson of his life, that human beings are not defined by their worst moments, but by the totality of their choices across a lifetime. James Sullivan had made a terrible choice that caused immense suffering, but he had then made thousands of subsequent choices to change, to grow, to help others, to live differently. Those later choices didn't erase the crime, but they revealed that James was more than his worst action. Similarly, Robert wrote that he hoped to be remembered not for the rage he had felt initially, which was understandable but destructive, but for the choice he had made to forgive, which defined the rest of his life and created his true legacy. The letter concluded with Robert's hope for everyone who heard his story. He hoped they would understand that forgiveness is not weakness but extraordinary strength. He hoped they would recognize that mercy and accountability are not opposites but can coexist. He hoped they would believe that people can change, that redemption is real, and that choosing love over hate, even when hate feels justified, is always the path to peace. And he hoped that his story would encourage at least a few people to put down the burdens of resentment they had been carrying, to open their hearts to the possibility of forgiveness, and to discover the freedom that comes from letting go. If Robert Chen's extraordinary story of forgiving the unforgivable has moved you, challenged you, or made you reconsider what forgiveness means, please take a moment now to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with someone who might be struggling to forgive, someone carrying the weight of old hurts, or someone who needs to be reminded that redemption is possible. Robert's testimony is a gift to all of us, a reminder that we are capable of far more grace, mercy, and love than we typically imagine. His story proves that forgiveness is not about condoning harm or forgetting injustice, but about freeing ourselves from prisons of hatred and creating space for healing and transformation. Your engagement helps ensure this powerful message reaches more people who desperately need to hear it, people who are trapped in cycles of anger and resentment, and who might find liberation through Robert's example. The story of Robert Chen forgiving James Sullivan, actively helping him rehabilitate, and welcoming him into his family after such devastating harm stands as one of the most powerful testimonies to human capacity for forgiveness ever documented. It challenges our assumptions about justice and mercy, about punishment and rehabilitation, about the possibility of redemption and the power of grace. Robert's choice to forgive didn't undo the crime or eliminate the suffering, but it transformed how that suffering would shape the rest of multiple lives. His forgiveness created ripples of healing that extended far beyond his immediate family, touching thousands of people around the world who witnessed his testimony and found in it permission to release their own burdens of hatred and resentment. That is the ultimate legacy of forgiveness. It multiplies, spreading hope and healing in ever-widening circles, proving that love is indeed stronger than hate, and that mercy will always be more powerful than vengeance.